Well, my name's Kathryn Wilson, and I am here with Paul. And this hopefully will be posted on the Randos United channel. We both are in the Bridges of Meaning channel. So yeah, the other day Paul had just posted saying, hey, really hard to get in with the other Paul. Be nice to chat with somebody on a Randos stream or something. And I thought, well, I'm free. So Paul, maybe tell me a little bit what brought you to this little corner?
Well, I suppose there's the Jordan Peterson explanation. So I mean that was for me, that was I think mid to late 2016, uh, right when he was starting to pop off, and I'd had some experiences that were moving me in that direction already. The Like, he talks about Carl Jung, and he talks about various Christian stuff, and he also brings up Taoism. And I studied Taoism for a number of years, and I'd kind of followed this path of, you might say, nominally being a political liberal, a social liberal. And I think the first step that really knocked me off of that was the 2008 financial crisis. And that got me on a rabbit hole of economics and finance. It started with uh, I was an avid NPR listener, not not so much anymore, let's say. Um,
Mhm.
but back then I was, and they had a podcast that they started, and this was still early days of podcasting. There were some podcasts out there, but not many, and they started this podcast, Planet Money, to explain everything that was going on with the economy. And I mean, at this point, that material was a bit would be a bit lightweight for me, but that was a gateway drug to other things. An economist named Tyler Cowen and another economist named Russ Roberts. Tyler Cowen, back then, blogging was the thing, if anybody remembers that.
In the stone age of the internet. Yeah.
And so Tyler Cowen was famous for this blog, Marginal Revolution. Now he has a podcast called Conversations with Tyler. And Russ Roberts was famous. He was they were both at George Mason University around near DC. I don't know exactly where it is. And Russ Roberts was doing a podcast called Econ Talk, and I just got deep into that. And so I was reading Marginal Revolution and listening to Econ Talk, and that got me into Austrian economics, which is sort of like basically the libertarian space. And so I got from that incentives matter. You know, the conditions you put people in, affect the choices they make. And it's not as if you can just, when we squeeze the balloon and you're hoping to shrink it in some uniform way, but it just pushes things out in different directions that are not predictable. And then I had a 10-year relationship end in 2012, and I had to get my life back together. And around that time, I encountered Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all.
It's a great book. Yeah.
And so what I got out of that was, no, conservative people are not evil or stupid or uneducated. There are temperamental drivers for political affiliation. And then, between that and the Taoism and all that stuff, when Jordan Peterson hit, I was ripe for his material. And I'd gotten into Jonathan Pageau from the jump with the metaphysics of Pepe.
Hmm.
So um, so I in 2017 I got the idea that I guess maybe I am a Christian living in a Christian culture, despite thinking I was an atheist. And so I just jumped into it and started going to a rock band fog machine church.
That's jumping into it. Yeah.
And I took it 100% seriously. I was working at a telemedicine startup, and those things have grown a bit since the whole lockdown episode. Um, and there was I'm the oldest of 6 kids, and there was a guy working with me, the CFO, who was from South Africa by way of Australia, and he had 5 kids, and we were pretty friendly. And he invited me to church like in March of 2017, and I just started going. And I have I have cynical tendencies, let's say, but I was all into that. I jumped up and down during the worship songs, and I got involved in the church and all of that. But it ran kind of thin at one point, and I remember thinking something along the lines of, well, I'm pretty convinced I have to be a Christian. Um, this situation doesn't seem to be working. Uh, Jonathan Pageau seems to be having a good time with Orthodoxy, so maybe I
Mhm.
should try that.
Mhm.
And so I just searched for a church in Austin, and I found St. Elias. And the main services we have during the week, there can be liturgies on other days, like if we're celebrating like the birth of the Theotokos or something. Um, but the main services are Saturday evening prayers, which starts the liturgical day for Sunday. This comes from Genesis. It was evening, then morning. The first day is how Genesis phrases it. So we we judge our liturgical days in terms of evening and then day. And so I put in the time for Saturday evening prayers into my phone calendar, and it was about 4 weeks before I actually showed up to one, despite the notifications. And soon after, I started going to liturgy. We were a growing parish. There are a lot of them that are growing these days. So you're traditionally you're not supposed to be able to perform 2 liturgies in the same church on the same day, but we got permission from the bishop to do an 8:30 liturgy and a 10:30 liturgy on Sundays. And it was mostly converts at the 8:30, and mostly um, cradle Arab descent, because this is Antiochian for 10:30. And because I was also working for the pastor's app company at the time, I would go to the 8:30 liturgy and then sneak over to the service at the other church. And I did that for a while until I decided I just couldn't. And I told the guy, and I still worked for the company for some time after that, but it was still kind of, I mean, the whole situation was a mess. And then I became a catechumen in September of 2018, and I was baptized in April of 2019. And I think it was probably while I was at the um, charismatic church that I found Paul's stuff, via the algorithm, and I've been following him pretty closely as well, and seeing how all this conversation has developed between everyone.
I'm curious your thoughts, moving from the charismatic church over to the Orthodox church. What are the biggest um, differences for you in terms of your own spiritual life? Maybe not differences in the church structure, but your own experience.
Um, Well, I don't feel I had much of a spiritual life at the charismatic church.
Mm.
Um, so are you familiar at all with Hillsong?
Just vaguely. I've heard some of their songs and heard a little bit about their story, but I haven't done a deep dive or anything.
Well, I mean, so Hillsong is a big mega church out of Sydney, Australia, and I only bring them up because they are the really famous one. But the church I went to was an attempt to plant a church in Austin by a church out of Melbourne called Planet Shakers. The guy that started it was a third generation pastor. I think his father and grandfather were specifically, what is that word? It's not charismatic. It's like it starts with an
Pentecostal?
R. Like Azusa
Uh,
Street Revival. I don't know why this is escaping me. No, not an R. Pentecostal. So I think his father and grandfather were specifically Pentecostal, and this guy came up in the 90s. I forget what his name is. I have one of his books on my shelf from those days. And he was like the cool pastor, and he grew up in the 90s. And so he wore like sneakers and a New York Yankees hat and all that jazz. And so they were trying to start this church in Austin. And I mean, everyone has their rituals. Like I remember taking a class at the Planet Shakers. You know, it's sort of like catechism. It's the equivalent, I guess. And they tell you all their values, and you know it's multiple weeks, and then you come on a Saturday and you fill out a sheet of paper with all the bad things you've done in your whole life. And this is supposed to be what they did when they met and they started thinking about starting their church. And then you walk up and you put it in the shredder. And that's some sort of weird baptism type ritual. Um, but there just wasn't a whole lot there. It was, I mean, for not to throw shade on a lot of these mega churches too much, but you know they're businesses, and it's hard for the people that run them to separate their business interests from helping
mm,
people. And to some extent I'm willing to extend some grace and say, yeah, this is probably better than nothing. But I mean, Joel Olstein, I don't know if you're familiar with that guy out of Houston. That's probably the
mhm,
most egregious uh modern example, and I don't know that he's uh a particularly bad guy, but the business aspect is rather naked and forward in that enterprise. And you know, I mean, I I obnoxiously brought up some of this at the conference, but like I've got a fundamental beef with Protestantism because there's no authority other than the self. And um then that, to me, that's a problem, because if what we're doing is being called to timeless principles and patterns, but there's no ultimate authority and tradition, then how do we know we can rest in that? Let's say, to bring in some language from the conference.
mhm,
And it did feel that whatever I feel like talking about today is what we're going to talk about. And you know, some of the sermons were good, but it was all, I mean, one thing is, you want to keep the people in their seats and the money rolling in, and there is an incentive to soft pedal things and not make um big demands of people.
mhm.
And I felt all that. And something about the Orthodox Church is, I mean, number one is the beauty, let's say. I mean, you were in St. Andrew on Sunday, right?
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
know, do you have any past experience with Orthodoxy?
Um, Not a lot. Um, so I followed Jonathan for a while. That was probably my first introduction to it. Um, And I have some friends who are Orthodox, but I hadn't been in a Greek Orthodox church before that. That was a first.
So there's the beauty of it. There's the structure of it. I skipped meditation and the other stuff on Sunday to go to liturgy, and you know liturgy is somewhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours, depending. In certain cases, a service can be much longer, but those are kind of rare, and that's usually um, something like a vesperal liturgy where we tack on vespers in front of the liturgical service.
Mm.
And it can be overwhelming. It can feel, well, it is very ritualistic, but it can feel very ritualistic. But there's a pattern and a structure to it, and it gets in your bones. And um, it's not about a particular agenda other than participating in the kingdom of God, and praying and trying to keep the world together. And there's something pure about it. And the my experience with Protestant services is that um it's not as much about God, it's more about the short-term interests of the people involved. And so, like, I mean, I've had spiritual experiences before, but I wouldn't say I ever had a spiritual experience in a Protestant church, and especially with those modern rock band services. There's
Mhm.
Maybe it's unfair to say, but they are trying to manipulate you emotionally, because it's like three songs that are very high energy. You're up and down and jumping, you get your
Mhm.
heart rate up, and then they
Mhm.
step into um more melancholy songs. And so they're taking you through this emotional arc using the techne of pop music. And
Mhm.
then they do stage theatrics where the really good ones, there might be fog and a light show and you don't notice the pastor come out, and then they cut to a video on the screen, and then the pastor comes back out and does the sermon, and then towards the end of the sermon the keyboardist comes back out and starts playing some um padded chords, to get you in the feeling. And so it's all very stage managed. And we have an arc in the liturgy, but it's not um like we don't do musical instruments. At most we'll have a choir. Often it's just chanters. And so there's not um like I sometimes I often I do feel things during liturgy, but it's not like they're not doing a whole song and dance show to drag it out of me.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think I've been to one of those kind of like rock and roll kind of Protestant churches a couple of times, and it does feel um it can feel like there's definitely like an agenda to make you encounter certain emotional experiences. Let's put it that way. And to be fair to the best of those in the crowd, I would say that probably is thought of as helping people by creating a space so that they can encounter these certain emotions that help them move towards God. That's probably the most generous, like the
Yeah.
best of them. That is what they're trying to do. And if you say, well, are you trying to play on people's emotions? Like, well, sure, but so is a liturgy. It's structure and it's patterning and it's helping build an emotional journey towards God so that once you come to the point of communion or whatever it is, you can have an encounter where you are emotionally present and available or whatever. I would say the best of them are probably trying to go through that process in good faith. But I am I'm a highly suspicious person.
Are you now?
Which people have uh, told me is not a good thing. That the hermeneutics of suspicion don't build good things. But they often help you to see things that are there. And so I'm like, well, I realize that I'm a fairly critical person when it comes to most things.
Are you a
So
Christian?
I'm a Christian. I'm a Protestant. Grew up Protestant. Grew up in a Protestant branch that is not of the rock and roll flavor. Much more you're lucky if there's a piano. Lots of time in reading scripture, prayer, preaching, sometimes singing older hymns. That's not the church I go to now, but that was sort of what I was raised in.
Mhm.
Um,
What kind of church do you go to now?
oh, that's a bit of a long story, but I do go to the charismatic church in town right now. I live in a really small town. It's like 8,000 people. So main reason why I go there now is it's the only place in town that has a youth group. And
Mhm.
so my kids go to that youth group, and
Yeah.
it's a place where they can have some community and some friends. And um, as is the case for most people, there's no church in town that like everything happens the way I would want it to happen,
Mhm.
right? There's no place where it's like, oh, the preaching's good and the community is good and the worship is good and everything lines up. So my basic thought was, there's nowhere here I can go where it ticks all my boxes anyhow. So I would rather go somewhere that is accessible to my kids in a holistic way and isn't only giving them just good teaching or just um, whatever. So that's why I go where I do right now.
I mean,
But I only moved
I
back.
think that's a good choice. Like, that's a good compromise, and I'll tell you why from my personal experience. Um, my dad grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts. My family has some land on Prince Edward Island, for whatever that's worth. When I was 8, we went up there and stayed on the farmhouse, and we had to pump well water and use an outhouse, and we dug clams.
That's cool. That's
Um,
cool.
but he grew up in a Baptist church in a town called Reading outside of Boston. It's a wealthy town. His dad worked for IBM, was an electrical engineer, and that's why I think one of the reasons he pushed me into studying electrical engineering in college. And he he's pretty smart. He just doesn't have a good appreciation for tradition and community structure, and he rejected the Bible on some sort of materialist rational means, and he tried raising us atheist, and so we didn't celebrate Christmas. uh we had a winter present day, but that was winter solstice. And so he couldn't he couldn't conceive of any value to being a part of a church. And my mother is not a very warm or personal person, and neither of them had like adult family friends. Like, we would get together as families and have dinner, so I grew up very isolated.
Mm,
um and so I think, regardless of, you know how much you align with the belief, trying to have a context of community for kids is noble, and it's worth sacrificing other things for that, because I've seen what that isolation does. And I mean, yeah, sure, like, I showed up I showed up with a big fancy camera, in a blazer, so maybe I look like I have things together, but there's a lot of brokenness in me, because
mm,
I was just very, like, a lot of things, like, I didn't get my driver's license until I was 28. um I played a lot of video games. I was on the internet when I was 12 years old. So there's a lot of these Generation Z things. I'm 41. Um, there's a lot of these Generation Z things that I was on the cutting edge, and not in a good way. Because they've been delaying getting their license. They delay family formation. Um, they're very online and that sort of stuff. And so I experienced a lot of that stuff before it was as endemic as it is now.
It's really interesting to me how much you line up with some of those Gen Z sort of steps, like you were just saying. Well, you just threw up a lot of really interesting stuff. So I like, we could go down any of these paths. We could
But
talk about.
feel free, like I just crashed the conference and I was a total unknown. So I think it's totally fair to grill me at this point.
You were an unknown. It was so fun. I'm like, who is this guy running around with his camera and his suit jacket and going off, little wave in the morning off to work out? It's like, okay, hi Paul. What's up here? So I was tempted at the beginning of this to start with, this is Paul. This is like a little ode to Paul's intro, except you're the Paul in this one. So I was like, oh, that'd be fun. But anyway, well, what do you feel like talking about more? We could talk about the conference. We could talk about your growing up and how isolating that was and how that isolation impacted you and your siblings. Or we could talk more about the Gen Z stuff that you were just touching on. All of that is interesting to me.
Well, what interests you the most? Because your level of engagement is probably most important to me to keep this interesting. So what grabs your interest?
Well, maybe let's start personal. Let's go in Paul Vanderklay's pattern and say, let's start personal and get to know you more as a person. And then we could maybe pop into the other things. So yeah, you said you're the oldest of 6?
Yeah, maybe I'll give you a kind of a fuller, though very summarized background. My parents met in Germany in probably in 1980 or 1981. I think that they were both Russian translators in the military, and I think my interest in the Soviet Union and Russian culture comes from absorbing their fears about what was happening with the world at the time. They got married in January 1982. I was born on an army base in San Antonio in February 1982. If that gives you some sense of how they structured that. And then they had 5 more kids. The youngest is 30, so 11 years younger than me. I think 3 of us were born in Texas, me and the youngest 2, and the other 3 were born in Massachusetts. I turned 9 on the drive down to Texas from Massachusetts in 91. And my dad worked his way into a computer job with the state of Texas. He finished his degree in English at UT Austin when he was 38. So that was, I don't know, somewhere in the mid 90s. I felt a lot like a children of immigrants in the sense that I didn't, because of the moving and because of being isolated, I didn't feel like I was a part of whatever the culture was. And my parents overemphasized education, and I did well at that. I went to gifted and talented programs in middle school and high school, and I ended up at UT Austin, which is the flagship of the state university system here. And I majored in electrical engineering. And after 4 years of that and graduating, I didn't know what to do with my life because my life had become go to school, complete assignments, do well at them. And it was all about that and my competitive drive. I entered university with 60 hours of credit, a bunch of AP tests and other things. And so I was taking senior level courses in my second year, senior level engineering courses. And I did a bunch of pure mathematics. And then I took some graduate courses as well in engineering. And I was roughly planning to get a PhD in microprocessor design, but I was pretty burnt out at that point. And somehow I talked people into letting me stay on a fifth year to finish a BA in pure math, but I was still burnt out and I failed a couple of courses. And then after about a year after that, really, with my girlfriend tolerating me not accomplishing anything, I finally got a software job, paid off my student loans in under a year, bought $10,000 worth of DSLR equipment, quit my job, pretended to be a photographer while putting on weight for 3 years. And then when that relationship ran into the shore, I had to get back into software and rebuild things. And I spent a lot of that time, weekends and nights, learning how to be a web developer and learning all the new technologies. And by 2014, I was making six figures for the first time in my life and realizing that, if I'd if I'd been more focused, I could have gotten there a lot sooner. But it's really in the Art of War, Sun Tzu says, he talks about dying ground, and it's the idea that sometimes you need to put your soldiers in a place where they have to fight or die. And that's where I was at that point in my life. And before, I'd never been forced to really make those decisions. And so I fumbled through a bunch of jobs. Then Jordan Peterson and going to church, and then Orthodoxy, and then the same year I converted. I found the current job I'm working at, and so things have been relatively smooth. But then the lockdown happened, and I met a girl in February 2021. I let's say I'd been with other women in the intervening years with no real success. And in February 2021, we had a snowstorm in Texas. There was snow on the ground for over a week, which never happens. And she came over to my place Wednesday during that week because her water wasn't running, or at least that was her excuse. And I brought her to church that Sunday, and we were engaged in August. And then in February 2022, she was baptized and chrismated. And then in the middle of Lent 2022 in March, she broke up with me. And then there was a whole year of a mess of on again, off again stuff. And this year, she brought her new boyfriend to Pascha. So that's been rather painful. She still goes to church, though I haven't seen her in the last few weeks. I mean, one of those is because I was in California, but the other two on either side, I don't know what she's up to. But so there's a period of time where church felt like a refuge from the world. And I guess this lines up with what Jonathan Pageau, Monsieur Pageau, was talking about in his talk. You eventually at church you will get disappointed, and that failed engagement was very much the point at which like real life, I think, entered my church experience. So yeah, that's my life story roughly.
And that sounds like it's fresh enough that that would still be like right on the front burner for you.
Yeah. I mean, like, so, um, are you familiar with John Hears at all?
No,
First Things Foundation. Why are we talking about rabbits?
just a little bit.
Okay. So, um, he his foundation opened a Georgian restaurant in Greenville, South Carolina, and people had been telling me I needed to take some time off to get my mind right. So I took 2 weeks off in October, and I flew out to meet him and go to his restaurant. And I drove down to Miami, stopping in Savannah, Georgia, and Orlando, Florida. And a part of that was to reauthor some of the stuff I'd gone through with the ex. The first summer we were together, I took her to Disney World in Florida for her birthday for a week. I didn't go to Disney World that time, but I, was just stopping through Orlando instead of other options. And it was a similar thing this trip. For Christmas 2021, we went to see her family. She's from the Inland Empire in Southern California, and we flew into Palm Springs and uh, had Christmas in San Bernardino and stayed in Riverside and went to Disneyland. And so I flew into Palm Springs, and there was a time in her life where she lived in Joshua Tree. So I went to Joshua Tree to take photos and see it for the first time. And I went to Riverside, and so part of that was re-experiencing that on my own. I do remember kind of, I mean, during that first year after the breakup, I would just start crying uncontrollably for I don't even know how many months, 7 or 8 probably. That doesn't really happen anymore. But I realizing I was going to have to make that trip out to California, even though you know, I booked the moment that first video came out, and then I added the Palm Springs and other stuff to that and made it a bit more than a week. Like knowing that I would actually have to do it was freaking me out a bit.
Mhm. Yeah. It sounds like you planned it to be fairly cathartic. Did you find it to be by the time you were done the trip?
Um, I mean, I feel, I don't feel terrified about going to Southern California at this point, I guess. But it was like it was a lot.
Mhm,
Like
mhm,
when I jumped on the stream on, I guess that was Friday. It was very uh overwhelming because oh, I'm in Palm Springs, oh, I'm in Joshua Tree, and I'm
mhm,
running around seeing all these people, and you know, you, uh, I'm in the Orthodox Church, and I have my godfather and godmother. He's a priest. Because I just was willing to walk into that situation, give it a try, and just kind of being like the guy in the pews fumbling over the book, trying to follow the liturgy for months, and
mhm,
um just being willing to step into that. So meeting him was wild, because I mean, I tweeted about this, but I mean, and other people have pointed out, like, don't emphasize individual people's role in this. God made it happen, and okay, sure, fine. I will
mhm,
concede that generally, but Jonathan Pageau had the courage to step out and be an example for people, and he led me to Orthodoxy. And you know for me, I owe him my life to a large extent, because without without the church, maybe I wouldn't have made that mistake of getting involved in that woman. But um the without the church, I wouldn't be nearly as together as I am
mhm,
today. So, my whole life rests on the church and that community I found.
Mhm. I'm so happy that you found that community. Like, it's so rare for people to actually find a community where they, like you have, the liturgy, they can move into it and then find their home in it, and then find people in that group where they're willing to um, be, like we were talking about, like a spiritual home that's not just disembodied. So I'm encouraged hearing your story. I'm happy that it's like, oh, you found a spot to land. That's that's
I
awesome.
I really believe that our lives are not our own. We owe things to other people. And I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about it, you know, responsibility over rights. But I think it's deeply fundamental to who we are as people. We need to be focusing on the needs of others and not ourselves. Um, you know, like that I got into Chino on Wednesday, and the first thing I wanted to do was go to the campsite to meet Grizz.
Mhm,
And I brought Doug with me because he ended up at the hotel at the same time. And we helped set up some tents. And I took Doug and Grizz and another guy out to Farmer Boys for lunch. And it's like, okay, I mean, I could be a cheapskate and not want to spend $70 or whatever. Not that that
mhm,
hurts me because I've got a stupid high-powered professional job that pays me way too much money. But it's just like I try to see what I have is not my own. It's an
mhm,
expense account God gives me so that I can get stuff done for him.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and so I just have to open myself up to possibilities and step into things. And that's how I try to live in general.
When did you make the shift? If you can like pinpoint maybe like a time or maybe even like a couple of years, but when did you make the shift from whatever your mindset was before to that mindset of like, I just want to serve other people, I want to care for them, my money is just an expense account. Like, when did that shift happen?
um, I mean, I think this will be funny. I mean, it happened gradually and then all of a sudden, like a lot of
Mhm,
things. Um, I remember when I was with my college girlfriend in the early 2000s, I was working for the Defense Department at a research lab in North Austin for UT, and she was working at an engineering research lab in the same general facility at the time. And for whatever reason, and we were both NPR listeners. We weren't particularly conservative, but for whatever reason, we started listening to AM talk radio. And even back then, they would all the advertisements for gold. I should have bought gold back then. I should have bought gold back.
what were you thinking, Paul?
I don't.
All the signs were there.
I, I'm sure I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. Um, and somehow we encountered Dave Ramsey. I don't know how familiar you are with him, uh,
A little bit.
but he talked a lot about how debt is dumb, and he brings up Bible verses about how the debtor is the slave to the lender. And uh, it would have been 2006, 2007. I can't remember exactly, but he started uh, a line. He started a podcast and other stuff called Entree Leadership. And he talked about being a servant leader. And that's probably the first time I heard that. And I definitely was not there mentally or emotionally or spiritually at the time, but I
Mhm,
listened and that was in me. And gradually I moved in that direction. And now that I lead teams of people, um, I can actually embody that. But it
mhm,
it took a while, and I think the ex fiance breaking up with me and how that left me a complete and total emotional wreck. I think that sanded off a few of the last rough edges of my aggression and egotism and self-centeredness, and now I can do it pretty well. But it was a long time because I'm very headstrong, and I'm more than happy often to take what I want. And so and
I will.
I said stuff like this to Paul, and he was like, I don't believe you. I was like, okay.
I read your, what was it, Discover Yourself or whatever, the
Yeah,
personality analysis.
yeah.
I'm like, no, I believe you. I believe you that you have like no agreeableness. Like, I completely believe you.
I mean,
It's a
the breakdown is like almost no politeness and moderate to high compassion, and that's like, I love people, but I haven't it takes a lot of practice for me to remain polite. Like, it's something I've had to work on. It's not,
Mhm,
I'm just super blunt. Uh
mhm.
and I try to cover that up by emulating politeness when I can, or just telling jokes to make it seem like I'm not serious.
Like, that was rude. Ha ha ha. It works though, because a lot of people who are polite can't imagine that other people would be so impolite, that then when you like play it off as a joke, they're like, it must have been a joke. Of course. So but it's good. That's like a huge point of personal growth, to choose to develop that out of compassion for other people, knowing that it's unkind sometimes, or uncomfortable for others at least. And so the fact that you've worked on it enough that you can effectively lead teams and they don't hate you, that's great.
Or they don't tell me.
They don't tell you. Which, I mean, can also be fine. You don't need to know everything.
No, I mean, I think at this point I'm doing a decent job. I wouldn't say I'm perfect, but uh I think I can get along with most people in most situations and not come across as a self-centered narcissist.
Well done.
Well,
That's good.
gold star.
Yeah. Well, I was curious, at the conference you showed up with the camera and like the whole jazz. Um, that was awesome. Are you gonna be putting the photos anywhere? I saw you threw a few up online, but
Yeah, I edited some real quick. I haven't had a chance to get to them. A lot of what I was doing was photographing for action. And
mm,
so um like there was that one shot I had, it's probably my favorite. I mean, Paul in preacher mode with his mouth open was a great one.
yeah.
Um but I was still getting into the swing of things because it had been months, other than Joshua Tree, since I picked it up. And um for those higher end cameras, there's a lot of nuance to how you operate it, and so you really have to be in the zone to be getting the best results. And so it was the second day when I dialed things in. And so my during the Pageau Vervaeke Dia Logos TM, um trademark of the Vervaeke Foundation. Uh, um, I went to either side of them to get over the shoulder shots. And what I did was I very carefully framed the image, and I had it on high speed continuous mode. And the reason for that is I mean, the basic elements aren't moving, like the table and the chairs and everything, and they're staying at the same height. So if you have the right framing, they're going to stay in the photo. But even though it's not like, say, a basketball game, there's still action, like Jonathan moving his hands and whatnot. So the idea is to get the rough framing correct, and then just kind of hold the shutter down and take a bunch of shots. And one of those will be a moment where facial expressions and body gestures uh, are aesthetic, let's say. And so I have probably a couple thousand photos at the high end, but a lot of it's the same framing, just trying to get um, a shot that really works.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I
Well,
will
once you,
review, and if any of it's
yeah,
any good, I'll put them up.
I'd enjoy seeing those once you get them sort of picked through and sorted and filtered and whatever. That'd be good. So when you were thinking about doing this, was there something you wanted to talk about, or were you just wanting to chat?
Uh, I mean, I just wanted to try this out and see what happens. I mean, it's sort of the same thing as the conference. I'm not, I don't know that at least not yet. I don't have any particular agenda. I'm just trying to dip my toes in the water and see what happens.
Perfect. I just didn't want to steamroll you if you're like, so now we've been talking for this long and I just wanted to get to this point or this topic I wanted to flesh out or whatever.
No, I mean,
So,
the conference was sort of like, oh, I've been out here paying attention, but now y'all know me because I haven't quite stepped out yet. And now's the time where, I guess I leverage some of that and see what I can do entering the arena,
mhm.
let's say. So, no particular agenda.
I'm curious how are you still like how do you integrate the background of Taoism into your current faith?
Have you read The Language of Creation?
Yeah.
Okay. Like it's the same. Like it's the same patterns as the Bible. Um
Mhm.
the like in Taoism these there's this symbol system broadly referred to as the I Ching,
Mhm.
and there are trigram and hexagram forms, and not to be too nerdy, but it's a binary coding. So 2 to the third, that's 8 trigrams, 2 to the sixth, that's 64 hexagrams. And um if you, I don't know, are you casually familiar with the South Korean flag?
Yeah.
The South Korean flag has 4 of the trigrams on it.
Mhm.
A lot of Southeast Asian culture originates in China. Um, it's a testament to I think the mountainous borders and the tenacity of the Korean people that they maintain a separate identity from the Han. But the all solid lines means heaven, and all broken lines means earth. And they have the same patterns that you'll find in the cosmology of the Bible. Um, so I developed my sense of the spiritual and the esoteric, studying Taoism, and I sort of moved from East to the Middle East when I went to Orthodoxy, and so the the stuff Pageau was talking about wasn't super alien to me because I'd already sort of purified myself of the materialist perspective and dived into the um, symbolic. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
It answers it perfectly. Yeah. Um, basically we're saying the underlying system of how to see heaven and earth are extremely tightly aligned.
I mean, it's all the same pattern. People, I think, pretty universally
Mhm.
saw heaven as this place of forms, and earth as material you could build out of, and it's about bringing the yin and yang together in order to make that happen. I think all cultures have kind of a heaven yang, um, male or masculine, let's say, versus earth yin, feminine, and that it's that those poles and how they interact that makes everything in the world possible through creation.
Mhm. Yeah, so that answered my question really well. I, are there ways where you feel like Orthodoxy extends that vision or particularizes it in ways that are important to you?
Um, I mean, Taoism is very abstract, like almost like mathematics. And I think there's something to the history and the tradition and the personalization in Christianity, that's meaningful and true. Uh, the other part of it is simply, as much as some people might think you can do Tai Chi and circling and other stuff, not to name names,
Mhm,
and that you can a la carte embody yourself. Um, the the problem at least I have with that is that there's the the only narrative there is the idiosyncratic narrative of yourself of, oh, this is when I picked up Tai Chi, oh, this is when I started circling, oh, this is when I read this cognitive science book. And so there's not a story you're fitting yourself into.
mhm,
And in Orthodoxy, we have the calendar. Like in September, I think maybe our liturgical some some Orthodox guys can totally skewer me over this because I don't know my stuff. But like I think the liturgical year, I know it starts in September, like equinox around there. Most kind of starts and stops of years in different cultures are on an equinox or a solstice. Like the Persian New Year's spring equinox. Um, and so the liturgical year starts then, and I think it's with the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple, but I might be wrong. Um, and so we live these feasts and fasts, these occasions. Um, a saint was born on this day or reposed on this day. I'm not particularly good at this stuff because I'm still it's hard for me to fully embody this stuff, but like
mm,
the day when we celebrate Saint George is the name day for people who that's the saint of, and I don't actually know what the Apostle Paul's day is, so I don't know when my name day is, but we've got this liturgical calendar of fasts and feast days, and the story that happens of Christ being born at the darkest time of the year, and then you know as winter is closing and spring begins, he dies and is resurrected. The fact that those are in the story there is not coincidental. And then we've got all the other ones. And so I live in this story every year. And to for a callback to my ex-fiance, like February we met, I started bringing to church. I remember Lent with her and going to the Paschal service, and I rem I remember when there was the gospel reading of, it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go in heaven. And she, in the middle of the homily, basically saying that I love money too much
mm,
to me. And I remember the fight we had after in the car. Um, and I remember her breaking up with me in the middle of Lent and how hard
mm,
Pascha was in 2022 because everyone was being so nice to her after the midnight service, and it was just so easy for her. And even though my godfather's a priest, I felt like I wasn't connected to people as well as I could be. And so my memories now fit into that story. And so, I just, I think it's necessary to live in a story, and it can't just be your own idiosyncratic narrative. It has to be something that's a part of other people's lives. And there's something about the tradition and the liturgical calendar that I think does that very well.
Mhm. Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I think the calendar grounds you through not just the space in the church and not just ideologically, but like you said, it patterns you through time, through your year, through the day. If you follow like a really tight liturgy and you have vespers and through the day, through the week, through the months, through the year, and then you keep going through the pattern in a way that we really don't have. Like our broader culture, we have a little bit. We still have like cultural holidays,
Yeah.
Valentine's Day, Mother's Day. It's kind of the closest we have culturally, but a lot of people,
Spooky season.
even those are becoming problematic, right? It's like, oh no, well, we can't celebrate mothers anymore. But maybe we still should, but maybe we shouldn't because it's kind of exclusive and it's hard on people who aren't mothers. And what about non-traditional mothers? And like it kind of like explodes. And then the same with Father's Day. And then Valentine's Day makes all the people who aren't dating really pissed off and all the people who lost somebody really sad. And so it's like, well, should we even celebrate Valentine's Day? And Christmas is pretty religious because that's a pretty Christian kind of. So like even within the broader culture, some of those time markers that we've had are becoming less and less certain that they'll be there 10 years from now.
Well,
Yeah.
the as Jonathan says, you have to live in a story. And we had, like, at least in America, I don't understand Canada very well, let's say, but in America we've got this, like George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, Paul Revere, Thomas Paine, blah 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 blah. We have this mythology, and we have this constitution, and not to get lost in the culture war, but we are we're tearing down this mythology. And uh without this mythology that centers us and focuses us into a people, we're not a people anymore. And I think, I mean, and that's been a broad issue. Like Martin Luther tried to keep a lot of Catholicism in what he built after his rebellion, but more and more, as that erupted across time and space, like Protestantism doesn't really have much of the liturgical calendar anymore, and some people are trying to staple that back in. And the Enlightenment erased a lot of that stuff, secular culture. So,
To be fair, it does depend on the brand of Protestantism. It's not, you're talking
what's
about it kind of broadly, like cultural Protestantism or something. But there are groups of Protestants, which are fairly large groups, like Anglicans, where they follow a pretty tight liturgical calendar as well.
Yeah, I mean,
So
there's some that have maintained it, but I mean, the overall
yeah,
thing is like, since the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, we've actively been tearing down the stories that hold us together.
yeah, for sure.
And it's no coincidence that we turn to things like nationalism and war, as a way to provide story for us. And it was like, I know Local Distance has been on Paul's channel a bit, talking about how, like, the Iraq war, it's not really a war, it's this thing that's invented as a media event. But we don't bear costs. We don't have a victory garden like in World War II. There's not a material impact on us. It's a story we're experiencing. And so when you don't have this local community, you don't have the story you're living in, other things are gonna replace that sooner or later.
Mhm. Do you have a personal theory on why we've been doing this in the West for a long time now? Do you see it as more like an organic thing that just kind of has been happening? Do you see it as the result of the rejection of a particular set of something? Do you see it more sinisterly? Like it's easier to control people who don't have a narrative, and so there's been some attempt to actively deconstruct?
I mean, there's Machiavellian tendencies involved in realpolitik, but um, I mean, I think that there are two forces, and I'm going to try and stay out of trouble here, so I'm going to be very general.
Okay.
One is there are people like me who are very capable of being individuals. And one way to one way to be an individual and to cover for that is by pushing that freedom on everybody, and then you don't stick out. And there's a number of places where I've seen that happen over like the last 500 years, but most people most people, that's just not, being an individual isn't for them. They need a direction and purpose handed down to them. They're not, like, none of us are really tabula rasa, none of us are blank slates, but some of us are closer to that than others. And I don't know if that's like who I am, or if just kind of being very broken, sort of like that in the Watchmen, the blue guy, whatever his name was, is he was like a nuclear scientist, and he got trapped in the experiment, and then he had to like rebuild his body. That can be a real thing, and I've been through that. So I don't know what the cause of that is, but when when everybody else is forced to be an individual and not have community, then that covers for us, and then we don't have to make sacrifices, we don't have to have obligations, we don't have to be duty, because being an individual is just what everyone does, and no one owes anybody anything, and as long as you're not harming anybody, you can do whatever you want. So I think that trend towards making everyone an individual is one aspect. I think another is increasing wealth. um for example, um when you're very poor, like, men and women have to make deals and form families just to survive. When you're very wealthy, um taxes get taken, anonymized, pay for police, and so fire department and grocery stores, and women can do a job or a career for an extended period of time and have protection that would usually have to come from making a deal directly with somebody. And so it frees us from having to make contracts and social bonds by being very wealthy. And we haven't and the obesity crisis comes out of this as well. So we haven't figured out how to create traditional community when we have so much money that we can afford to separate ourselves from each other. And it was that poverty that forced, women to make thread and cook and pass recipes down to their daughters, and husbands and sons to hunt and to learn, things like that. and to become strong enough to protect their families and to make sacrifices and lay down their lives. And now it's like I'm incredibly wealthy and privileged. Like I don't have to serve in the military, and it's a very narrow demographic in the United States that has to do that. And so I don't have a personal connection to those sacrifices either. So as much as I might say criticize women for using wealth to avoid direct personal connection with men, like it's not like I'm put in a position where I have to make sacrifices to women and children. Um, and so, I think the wealth is a big one. So how do we solve that? I don't know. It's very hard to choose to make those sacrifices to, like, oh, I'm not going to chase after a career because as a woman, having kids is the most important thing to me, and I'm not going to chase after my stuff because being ahead of a community and sacrificing myself for other people is more important than um buying a Corvette. That's the position we've put ourselves in, and it's like $30,000 a year. Some people might consider that close to poverty in the United States, but I heard somewhere that is the top 1% of income for the whole world. And so we don't appreciate how wealthy we are, or what it takes to get and maintain that wealth, and how the fact that we no longer have to sacrifice is undermining our ability to keep that wealth.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think the wealth factor is a really good point, because it does free us to not have to rely on each other, not have to trust each other, not have to invest in each other. Because like you talked about a few times in your story, just because you invest in something doesn't mean that it turns out the way that you thought it would, or the way that you're like, I put in 10, I should get like at least 8 back. Like there's some kind of a structure to this that's reliable. But relationships aren't that way. Parents disappoint us, kids disappoint us, spouses, girlfriends, grandparents, friends, everybody disappoints us. It is the nature of the world. And so, yeah, if you can be in a position where you can insulate yourself from that risk, you have to have a pretty good reason for why you wouldn't. Why not just not invest in anybody? Like Kyle Lowry and be like, no, not Kyle Lowry. Who's the other point guard for the Raptors? Oh, it's gonna kill me later.
Is that the Toronto team? I
Yeah,
don't I don't know
yeah.
sports.
Oh, it's killing me right now. He drives me crazy. His tagline is like, he's betting on himself. You
Oh
just
yeah.
bet on yourself all the time. It's like you could, but then you end up where we are now, where it's like, well, what do you get from that? You're isolated. You have all this money. Okay, so you buy a bunch of toys. You go on some trips. Then what? Like, it gets old fast. It gets
Yeah.
old fast. And you may not know that until you have the chance for it to get old fast. But like you said, the wealth pulls us apart, and then it just creates more suffering. Because one of the things with betrayal and friends and family, like, that hurts, but you're gonna have the hurt come out somewhere anyhow. Like, if you don't have friends and family, that hurts too. So not hurting isn't really an option. It's more like, where are you gonna choose? Where's the pain worth it? Like, what's worth it?
Well,
And go ahead.
the challenge is, you're 20 years old, even these days, with extended adolescence, people in their 30s, they think they're going to live forever. And I've heard
Mhm.
that priming people with the idea that they are actually mortal and they're going to die makes them have more kids. Um, and the 60-year-old matriarch with 6 kids and a handful of grandkids, you know, she fought with her husband. Maybe he cheated, maybe she cheated, maybe she threw pots and pans at him. Maybe some of the kids were horrible when they were teenagers, or almost certainly. And, you know, but then you get to 60 and you look back and it's like, I love that man. We built a good life together. I love seeing my kids and my grandkids on Thanksgiving and Christmas. And the natural course of life would just put you on that path because you didn't have birth control. And
Mhm.
even if you were, let's say, less passionate than other people, like pressure would get you across the aisle and into marriage. Um, but now, you know, I'll think about it after I work on my career. And then you're 30 and it's like, oh, I thought I'd be married by now, but I'm sure I'll find him someday. And then
Mhm.
before you know it, you're 50 and you don't have kids and you don't have grandkids. And then you're looking at the rest of your life and it's, you know, it's going to be tough. And being able to connect the interests of the 10-year-old and the 20-year-old and the 30-year-old and the 40-year-old and the
Mhm.
50-year-old and 60-year-old, being able
Mhm.
to unite that, that's what tradition does. And breaking down tradition and breaking down community and replacing it with entertainment and wealth has left us lost and confused.
You can put that on blast. I think a lot of people need that and need to step into a tradition. And I think people can get stuck, like there can be people who get to that point and then they get stuck on, but which tradition should I step into? Like, which
Oh,
one do I go
Orthodoxy,
into?
obviously.
There
No.
you go. You gotta put a little plug for your peeps, right? You gotta put it out there.
I
That's
mean,
fine.
but finding community is important. You know, my biggest concern though is it can't be too self-consciously constructed by men. There, it actually needs to be a higher thing than yourself. And so the closer it is to the earth, the more I'm suspicious of it because, I mean, like Paul's going through this whole thing where his church might split. And I think a big part of that is there isn't a strong rooted tradition. And I think he said something else during the conference. It might have been how, or maybe I heard him say it somewhere else, how the proof texts for their doctrine, like the doctrine hasn't changed, but the proof texts have changed over time. And, you know, if your stuff isn't rooted in something timeless, traditional, and handed down, if you don't have that rock, you know, to build your church on, you know, then you are going to be swayed by the times and the spirit of the age. And that's something that I think all Protestants need to, you know, I mean, my vote would be come back to traditional Christianity. I know that's not easy for everyone, but I mean, at least the first step needs to be is like, you know, do we have what we need to actually stay rooted? You know, where does this fact that we keep getting pulled by the spirit of the age come from? And I think that's a big problem for the non-traditional branches of Christianity because they're built on rebellion, and it's the same thing. Like every teenage generation is always fighting their parents because it's in our
So,
culture.
as a Protestant, I do have to push back against that one.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that Protestantism is built on rebellion. I would say, and we don't need to dig into this too much, but Protestantism was built on the desire to be faithful in a context of a Catholic Church that was not being faithful to the ministry it was called to at that time in that context. And so it was actually built on a desire for deep faithfulness, seeing that the leadership around them was acting in a way that was rebellious to the call that was on them already. So As a Protestant, I just gotta poke the narrative a
That's
little
fair.
bit.
That's fair. You're not going to offend me.
Okay. Yeah. That said, I do completely agree with your point on you have to be grounded in a tradition and it needs to be bigger and beyond yourself. And the more that you have a clear tradition and the more generations you can stack within that tradition and it's articulated and it's inhabitable, the more that that is realized in the deep itself for you, the more, and the people in that community with you, the more power and strength that will have. Because you could also have a kid who grew up Orthodox, but they chose to kind of zone out for most of it. They don't actually know why they have the traditions they have. It's just things that they do. And because they haven't invested fully within that tradition and chosen to live it out, it's just kind of happening, then you'll still have the same problem because they aren't rooted in that tradition. So I think part of it is you need to have a tradition where you're choosing to root yourself within it. The nice thing is if you're a kid who grows up Orthodox, it's much easier to have access to a deep tradition to root yourself in when you choose to do that rooting.
And you can't force, not that this is a problem for me yet since I don't have any kids, but you
Yeah.
can't force your kids to remain Orthodox.
Yeah.
You can do your best to raise them in the tradition, and you'll probably an average outcome is going to be faith is kind of thin, into their late teenage years. Maybe they kind of step away from it from a bit. They run into some troubles, and hopefully they know to run back to a church and go to confession. And hopefully those experiences reroute them in the church and their faith becomes solid. Like my dad's grandfather, I think, built boats. I don't think, maybe for fun. And I heard something about him sinking the boats. Like he'd put the boat together, but they weren't entirely watertight. And by sinking them, that caused the wood to swell. And so that would seal up the joints and then eventually would float back up, and you'd have a boat that actually could stand the water. And there's an extent to which, I mean, you do need that death and resurrection, and not just once. That's I mean, I believe in the death and resurrection of Christ. I believe in demons and angels, and people can call me crazy about that if I want. But even without considering that limit case, like the pattern of getting to a point where stuff isn't working and that part of you has to die and you have to be reborn as something different, that's real.
Well, I probably need to go,
Okay.
but it was really good to talk to you, Paul. It was nice to see you at the conference, and this has been great. We didn't really get to sit down at the conference and talk, so getting to do it now is a treat, and I will hopefully see you around on Discord and Twitter and wherever else you might inhabit.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be more of a presence, and who knows, maybe I'll become the official estuary conference photographer or something.
Oh, I would love that. That would be awesome.
Well, thank
All
you
right,
for your
well,
time.
for sure.